channel for our second live stream of the weekend. Usually we do 3, but this week, due to scheduling issues, we've only been able to do 2. We did an hour and a half yesterday discussing our usual Q&A with so many different questions and topics. It was a lot of fun. And then, of course, we will be doing our usual Sunday afternoon live stream lecture for about an hour. And then if anyone has any questions at the end of the lecture, we will be doing a short Q&A to wrap it up so that everybody gets 2 hours of Q&A, an hour and a half yesterday and a half hour today. We usually are here Friday evenings and Saturday evenings for the live stream Q&A, and then Sundays is the live stream lecture, but there might be some time for a Q&A at the end of today's live stream lecture. And today, Friendly Neighborhood Historians, which is anyone who likes and subscribes. It's as easy to become a Friendly Neighborhood Historian as liking and subscribing. We will be discussing the impact and importance of Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor Day was just yesterday. 84 years ago, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, signaling the beginning of World War II. So we will be discussing the impact and historical relevance of that event. We will also be discussing World War II from the perspective of the Japanese and the Japanese Americans and what they went through. And so it's going to be hopefully an informative and interesting lecture, some history that everyone is pretty familiar with to one extent or another if they like history, if they enjoy social studies. But from a different perspective, with a different nuance to it that I think everyone can really appreciate, and that's what we do here on the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. We bring you all sorts of what else? Friendly history, interesting things, things you never heard about and learned about. That's what we do here all the time. We've got short and long form content dropping daily, long form content a little less often, but we enjoy what we do here. We really appreciate all the support of our fans and our Friendly Neighborhood Historians. So if you like history, if you like learning about social studies, geopolitics, past and present, social sciences, which we discuss in the live streams, I discuss in videos, short form and long form, like I mentioned. If you want to learn more about history, if you want to expand your historical horizons, then join the growing number of Friendly Neighborhood Historians. Our goal is 6,000 by the end of the year. And the easiest way to do that is to like and subscribe. I don't ask for much. I don't ask for anything special. Like and subscribe, and that's how you become a Friendly Neighborhood Historian. It's as easy as that. You don't have to give me your credit card or social security number or last name or mother's maiden name. None of that stuff. Oh, good to see you, Otter. You just have to come, enjoy the live streams, and ask questions when it's a Q&A. And feel free to drop any comments or feedback or things you're thinking about in the chat as we go through the live stream lecture. We won't necessarily be answering questions until the very end. If we do have any, we'll see how that goes. But it's just a nice way to spend your Sunday afternoon, hopefully doing some history with us, or Sunday evening if you're over in Europe, like my great moderator, Simon the Bunny. Make sure to show Simon the Bunny some love in the chat, like and subscribe, and then boom, you're a Friendly Neighborhood Historian. Without further ado, we're going to do what we always do in these live stream lectures, and we are going to talk about important historical topics. And our topic today is Japan during World War II. Specifically, hello, welcome, good to see you. My moderator Simon will be handling everything. Oh, by the way, follow the social media handles in the chat and listen to the little bit of a history of World War II from the Japanese perspective and how the Japanese got involved and what happened on Pearl Harbor and all of that great stuff. And if you're enjoying that, if you love learning about these sorts of things, consider liking and subscribing and becoming a Friendly Neighborhood Historian. It really helps the channel grow. This is our live stream lecture, and it's great to see everybody here. So we can't talk about World War II often enough without talking about World War I and what happened in World War I. Now, a lot of historians believe what happened in World War I caused World War II, and that the events of World War II are a result of the Great War, or the war to end all wars. Now, obviously, everyone called it the Great War, the war to end all wars, because they didn't know there would be a Second World War. They called it the war to end all wars, the Great War. A lot of people hoped that this would be the last major bloody international conflict that involved basically every continent, fighting on every continent, except Antarctica, in history. And of course, there would be another one. And Ferdinand Foch, the leader of the French forces, said at the Treaty of Versailles, where Germany got punished and all sorts of things went askew, he basically said in 20 years there will be another war. So he was excellent in predicting that. But Japan had a role to play and an important part to play in World War I, and a lot of people do not talk about the Asian theater of the war in World War I enough. Basically, both Japan and China, who had been influenced and communicating with the West for a long time, since the middle of the 19th century, now decided it was the time to would get involved in the conflict, not nearly as much as the European empires were, like Germany and France and Great Britain, and of course the United States comes in 1917. But Japan got involved in the war in 1915 and started attacking German forts honoring its peace treaty and alliance with France, the Japan and Russia, not Russia, but France. Japan started attacking German forts along the coast of China. They attacked the Cayman Islands, which the Germans was a colony of the Germans at the time. They actually seized the islands eventually. So the Japanese were actually pretty aggressive in the Eastern theater of the war, and trying to undermine the Germans' international and imperial standing, and making things difficult for the Germans there. And of course, they interacted with the German Navy more than anything else in the notorious U-boats, which would sink anything. Unrestricted submarine warfare would be the downfalls of the Germans, as it got the Chinese involved, it got the Argentinians involved, and the resuming of it in 1917 would eventually get the Americans involved in the war. So Germany's raving aggressiveness would bring about its destruction in the First World War, and of course, down with it would go, and falling down with it would be the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarians, and Bulgaria, and anyone else who had helped the Central Powers, as they came to be known, because they were in Central Europe. So. But basically, Japan got involved in the war on the side of the Allies and helped the Allies a significant amount throughout most of the conflict, and was actually pretty successful at helping the Allies in Asia and in the western side of the Pacific Ocean. They were very successful at helping the Allies and the Germans, and undermining the Germans and weakening them and stretching out their supply lines, stretching out their military activities, so that the Germans weren't as strong or as settled as they needed to be, and weren't able to focus as much resources and effort on the Western Front, where you had the trenches, or on the Eastern Front, where they were kindly doing their best to knock out the Russians. So basically, Japan felt that it deserved, because it was an aggressive fighter on the side of the Allies during the Entente, as it was originally called, France, Great Britain, Russia, and later the United States. They believed that they were a major player in the war, and that they had the right to get a lot of power and to gain land, territory, influence, and wealth, and that the Germans owed them war reparations the same way they owed the French and the British war reparations, which were really, really harsh for the Germans to pay. Now, war indemnities were common in wars, especially in the 19th century, so it wasn't crazy for the Allies to demand war reparations from the losers. The losers paying was a common theme throughout all of history, but the Germans were made to pay a very heavy war indemnity and to accept the war guilt clause of the Treaty of Versailles, which basically said they were responsible for the war happening, so they were at fault. However, Japan was not given a high indemnity. It was not paid back. It was not rewarded with much land. It did not get the Cayman Islands that it had seized from the Germans during the war. So basically, the Germans were basically, despite the fact that Germany was punished heavily, and that the Austro-Hungarian Empire fell apart, and the Ottoman Empire fell apart, and despite the fact that Japan had had a significant role to do with that, although a diminished one compared to Britain, France, or the United States, and especially in the history books, the Japanese were not rewarded with this. They were not given any sort of long-standing reward from World War I, and they felt that they had been snubbed by the other allies. They weren't the only ones. The Italians also felt that they had been snubbed because they didn't receive that much money or land from the Austro-Hungarians, who they'd been fighting mostly during the war. Initially, Italy had been part of the Central Powers, along with Germany and Austro-Hungary, but had defected to help the Allies in the second year of the war. So both Italy and Japan, despite all of their efforts at undermining and destroying the Germans and Austro-Hungarians, didn't get the payment, reward, territory, or prestige that they had wanted to get. Now, this was particularly offensive to the Japanese, who knew that part of the reason they didn't get what they wanted was because of racial biases and imperialistic notions of superiority. This is the time of social Darwinism, and when people basically believed that they were superior to whites believed they were superior to non-white civilizations because of their technological advancements, despite the fact that those technological advancements have been used during the war to destroy tens of millions of lives, almost many of them in an instant, in horrible and shocking ways, and to alter the course of human history, changing the lives of not tens of millions, but hundreds of millions through injury, warfare, devastation, psychological trauma called shell shock, which we now call PTSD, things of that nature. And so Despite all of that, Japan had been seen as inferior by the Western powers because they were not white. They were Asian. They were seen as an inferior empire and had really only been in the industrial age for the last few decades after the Americans had pressured them in the 1850s under Commodore Matthew Perry into basically deciding to either be taken over by the Europeans and Americans, like the Chinese kind of were at the time, or to get to join the age of imperialism, rapidly industrialize, embrace democratic government, and modernize their military, which the Japanese did. They got rid of the old feudal samurai system that had dominated them for thousands of years almost, and replaced it with a more balanced modern military that was extraordinarily strong and effective. They had shown themselves over and over again to be fierce and powerful fighters. In 1904, in the Boxer Rebellion of the late 1800s, when the Chinese, under the Empress Dowager Wu, decided to try to overthrow European influence in China, where France, Germany, Russia, and Great Britain were carving up areas of China for trade influence and cultural power, the Chinese basically decided to have a rebellion. And it wasn't the Americans or the British or the French who put down the rebellion. It wasn't these Western powers. It was Japan who had spent the most amount of time and effort doing that, and they really didn't get that much credit or reward. But it did prove that Japan was a highly mechanized, highly industrialized, powerful empire in its own right. They did the same thing a few years later. They put down the Russians tried to take land in Manchuria, leading to the Japanese attacking in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905. I have a video on that if you'd like to check that out. But basically, the Japanese surprised the whole world by embarrassing the Russians. Now, Russia is the largest country in the world. It was then, certainly. It had a huge amount of men, but it was not nearly as industrialized or modern or powerful as the Japanese. The Japanese were faster, quicker, and better, and demolished both the Russian military army and Russian navy, leading to a collapse of the old Russian system and a revolution in 1905 that almost destroyed the Russian Empire, which would be finished with the 1917 revolution at the end of World War I that would destroy the Russian Empire for good. So Japan had proven its steel in the Russo-Japanese War, shocking everyone in the West with an Asian superpower now being just as good as a European power at demolishing a weaker European power, the Russians, who weren't as strong as the Germans, the French, or the British. So that meant that Japan was probably just as strong as the Germans, the French, or the British, or the Americans for that matter. So Japan had proven its steel. It had shown itself considerably strong over and over again, and it had been a strong player in undermining Germany's influence and reach in East Asia during World War I and mitigating their power, influence, and their submarine warfare. But despite this, they didn't get the rewards they deserved, and once again, they were overlooked, probably because they were not white, probably because their civilization was seen as inferior, because the Europeans believed that everywhere they went, they were superior to the other civilizations, and that led to colonization, like I mentioned, in China and India, and of course Africa during the early 1900s. So the Japanese kind of got left out in the mix a little bit, probably for racial reasons. And this led to a lot of resentment and anger by the Japanese. So Germany, Italy, and Japan in World War II are victims of resentment. Germany is resentful of the Allies, especially with the Nazis continually banging this drum of the Allies' punishment at Versailles in 1919 at the end of World War I. But Italy and Japan are bitter because they did not get the rewards, glory, prestige, or territory that they had wanted to get at the end of those wars. And the Allies had kind of overlooked them, whether it was the Italians or the Japanese, because Britain, France, and the United States had basically tried to control everything after that. So Japan had a very interesting 1920s, and it saw the rise of new nationalist ideas in Japan, where basically the feeling that they have been pushed out by the Westerners and not gotten the successes and victories that they deserved led to a lot of resentments and anger, and this growing idea that they needed stronger prestige, they needed more recognition, and they needed to be more powerful, more influential, and more militaristic. And so throughout the 1920s, stronger militaristic parties on the right started to take more and more influence and power in Japan, limiting the former growing influence of the emperor and basically controlling the German government and parliament, so that by the time we get to World War II, the most powerful people in Japan are the military leaders and the head of the military, Hideki Tojo, which was a common insult used by Americans against the Japanese, calling them Tojos during World War II. It's a slur. So It's a World War II based slur that almost nobody uses anymore because nobody knows who Hideaki Tojo was. But by the time World War II began, despite the belief that Emperor Hirohito was a god, a kami, K-A-M-I, not C-O-M-I-M-I-E, but a kami, a spirit in the ancient Japanese religion of Shintoism, where he was honored as a god, he had no power. And this was common in Japanese history. It was Emperor Meiji during the industrialization in the 1860s who had asserted his influence and dominance as the central powerful figure in Japan. And Hirohito would do this at the end of the war when he basically told the Japanese military to go home and stop fighting the Americans. So, getting back to it, so throughout the 1920s, Japan grows in military influence, and basically starts to feel that it realizes that it is the most powerful independent nation in Asia, and that France controls Southeast Asia, the Dutch control Indonesia, and the British control India and Burma and parts of China, while China has become significantly weakened. In 1911, the Qing dynasty collapses, which is the last imperial dynasty, and then a series of warlords fight for control of large sections of China throughout World War I and after World War I. And China also got snubbed from any sort of reward despite helping Britain, France, the United States, and Russia during the war. The Chinese are also under the growing leadership of their own nationalist party that wants to set up a Republican kind of government, and I'm using Republican to mean a representative government, not Republican as in Donald Trump Republican necessarily. But the rise of a nationalist Republican movement in China is led by a man named Sun Yat-sen, and he is succeeded by Jian Jieshi, who in the West we call him Chiang Kai-shek, who will lead the nationalists in China during the 1920s and 30s. There are also other movements in China that are not as strong but are influential. You have the warlords, you have the Chinese peasantry, which is kind of in the middle, and you have the rise of the Chinese communists, the Gomshandong. And the Gomshandong, the communists in China, are going to become more and more powerful throughout the 1920s and 30s until Jian Jieshi decides to target them and their leader, a man named Mao Zedong, in the early 30s. So Japan is watching China go through all of these changes and issues, and they're realizing that they are far more influential and powerful than China. They've already taken over Korea, and so Korea is a puppet state of the Japanese, and definitely in their sphere of influence. And they decide that it is their turn to take over. Most of Asia is either semi-imperialized or fully imperialized by the Europeans. Japan is fully autonomous. It's the most powerful. It has the most resources, the most weapons, and it is extraordinarily militaristic and aggressive. So, in 1931, the Japanese at the Mutkin Bridge in Manchuria, there is a fight that breaks out between the Manchurians and the Japanese. Now, the Manchurians are part of China to some extent, especially after Mao takes over in 1949. But Manchuria is considered kind of its own buffer region between Russia, Korea, Japan, and China, and has been considered like that for decades. The Russians tried to conquer it in the First Russo-Japanese War. The Japanese had taken it back. So this was disputed territory, and some have dated World War II as starting in 1931, all the way back in 1931, when the Japanese attack and invade Manchuria and take over. So this is the first huge militaristic move by the Japanese, and the War Department in Japan and the military-industrial complex and the industrial system is going to be the most powerful in Japan throughout the rest of the 1930s, and of course they're going to run the country basically as a dictatorship during the 1940s. Now, were they necessarily fascist? I don't think that it's fair to apply the term, Mussolini's term in Western thinking to a Japanese country that wouldn't have accepted that terminology during this time. But they definitely had some fascist tendencies. They were extraordinarily nationalistic. They were very influenced with expanding their influence, power, and prestige. And they relied heavily on their military, and they relied heavily on the patriotism of their people. And the biggest way the Japanese made their people patriotic and nationalistic and approve of all of these military interactions and efforts was by basically highlighting that this is what the emperor wants, that the emperor is a god, that this is the right thing to do, that you are following the role of the emperor, that you are following what your god, the emperor, wants to do. So, and Japan is going to be the greatest empire in the world, and we are going to show the entire world just how great we are. And that's going to be a common attitude that the Japanese have, basically using their emperor, a man named Hirohito, who has no real power, which is common throughout Japanese history with few exceptions, as a puppet to basically get the Japanese people more and more invested in the war effort throughout World War II. So now this is an interesting, now the next point is an interesting one. So a lot of people have World War II starting in 1939 when Germany invades Poland, and that brings the British and French empires, French and their empires into the war. A lot of people think World War II begins on September 1st, 1939. I am not one of those people, despite being a historian. Some people say it's 31 when Mutakin is attacked by the Japanese. That's way too remote and isolated of a land for me. Some say 1935 when Mussolini invades Italy. The Italians aren't really part of World War II until Hitler knocks France out. But 1937 for me is when World War II actually starts, when the Japanese at the Marco Polo Bridge in China invade China and begin what's called the Second Sino-Japanese War. And this war is going to last all throughout World War II, and obviously is not talked enough, but basically the nationalists led by Jiang Jieshi and the Gomchangdong, the communists now led by Mao, fresh off of their long march where they had basically went around China all the way to the northern part near Manchuria, where Mao was from, in order to get away from the nationalists, are going to unite and fight the Japanese. Eventually, during World War II, the British, the Indian soldiers who fight for the British, the Americans, they're going to do everything they can to strengthen the Chinese, be it Jiang Jieshi or Mao, to be able to defeat and destroy the Japanese influence in China. But for the first few years, Japan is extraordinarily successful at what it does in China. They're brutal, they're fierce, they have a similar, you could compare it in some ways to the blitzkrieg of the Germans. They move through the country at lightning breakneck speed. They have the better technology, they have all the forces they need. And of course, the thing the Japanese have best, being an island, a series of islands, Japan has an extremely strong military. They have aircraft carriers. They have a huge amount of pilots, a very strong air force. So their Navy and their Air Force are extraordinarily brilliant and powerful. And because of this, and this is obviously where we get the word kamikaze, divine, which comes from the Japanese word for spirit and wind, divine wind, the spirit wind. Basically, Japanese pilots are much more likely, if they run out of fuel or get hit, to crash into an enemy base, building, or ship in order to cause as much damage as possible, rather than crashing and dying on their own. So there's this constant theme of ritual suicide in Japanese history, and it is no less different in World War II with their Air Force. But their powerful Air Force, their fierce troops, their heavy artillery, all of this, they're able to basically kick China around and slap it around for the next few years. And China's really going to struggle until Japan, once again, like the Germans in World War I, becomes overextended by fighting in the Pacific against the Americans and the British. So the Chinese are really going to struggle. The Japanese are going to show a level of brutality and anger that seems more about thousands of years of hatred between Japan and China, and racial tensions or ethnic tensions between the two people groups who have vied for the dominance of Asia for thousands of years, rather than just militaristic aggression of a semi-fascist militarist group leading Japan's patriotic military during the 1930s and 40s. There is far more. When I consider what the Japanese do in China, I think of it far more in terms of thousands of years of competition for Asian dominance between these two empires, similar to how I see the Soviet war crimes committed in Eastern Europe as far less to do with the Nazis and far more to do with centuries of animosity between the Russians and different European groups. Which interestingly enough, there are some strange parallels. And I don't want to get too much into detail because some of it is very unpleasant to talk about, but there are two things that I must bring up about Japan's activities in China. One is in 1939, I believe it's 39, might be 38, the Japanese take the Chinese city of Nanjing after a long siege. Now, we call it Nanking in the West, but the Chinese and the Japanese call it Nanjing. And after taking Nanjing, and Chinese, I've known young Chinese people who still know this. This is part of their national identity. This is part of this is a psychological scar on Chinese history, on the Chinese people to this day. Basically, the Japanese decide to perform a ritual mass uh, force themselves upon the Chinese women and children and men in the most brutal and nasty of way, basically to the point where this kills the people. Thousands of people die. It's also, of course, includes torture or murder, theft, destruction of property, all sorts of horrible things. But the it is called the taking advantage of Nanjing. Need I say more? It is absolutely it is an absolute huge scar, and as my moderator Simon the Bunny is pointing out, the Chinese people still deal with this scar and still hate what the Japanese did to them at Nanjing. It is an awful, awful thing, and it's one of the saddest chapters in history. That's one thing that I think a lot of people know about, and I believe it was 100,000 people who were killed at Nanjing. And the Japanese did similar assaults and war crimes against the Chinese throughout the Sino-Japanese War. They also were known for their notoriously horrible prisoner of war camps for the Chinese, for the British, and for the Americans, and they are particularly nasty. Whereas German, American, and British prisoner of war camps were not nearly as awful. Now, interestingly enough, but interestingly enough, that prisoner of war, the Japanese have a particular animosity towards the Chinese in their prisoner of war camps. And they decide to, as the Russians did in Eastern Europe at the end of World War II, and as the Germans did to the Jews, the Nazis, they perform experimentations, torture sessions. There is a particular Japanese military group called Unit 731 that performs basically atrocious human experiments and war crimes on Chinese POWs during World War II and the Sino-Japanese War. And very few people in the West know about this. It is very horrific. Very few people know about what the Soviets did in Romania at the end of World War II, and some of the things they did to not the Germans, the Eastern Europeans, and the Japanese did the same thing to the Chinese in Unit 731. We all know about Dr. Joseph Mengele, hopefully, but basically, the point is that very few people know about what the Japanese did during World War II to the Chinese in Unit 731, but it is comparable to what Mengele did in I believe it was he at Auschwitz? I believe he was at Auschwitz. But anyways, so that's obviously really sad and difficult stuff to hear about. But what happens next? So Japan joins sides with the Germans and the Italians, probably because all sides are very respectful of each other's military aggressiveness. And basically, Japan gets the feeling from Germany that Germany and Italy, but mainly the Nazis, will allow them to take as much land from the Europeans in Asia as they can, and this is their chance to get back at the Europeans for snubbing them for their racial prejudice, and basically for treating them like a little brother and ignoring their efforts in World War I, ignoring their victory over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War, and this is their way to carve up large sections of European empires and create a Japanese empire that has huge hegemony over East and parts of Central Asia. And so their biggest target throughout World War II against the British will be India. They won't quite get there because they're going to have to go through Burma, which is now Myanmar. But basically, they also, when they join the war on the side of the Axis with Rome and Berlin, the Rome-Berlin Axis, which is, a straight line between them. And now you have Tokyo in that axis. And they basically work with the Germans and the Italians to undermine the other European enemies, and they do this mainly in Eastern Europe. Eastern Asia. So while the Germans are attacking France, and while Britain is struggling to defeat the Italians and the Germans in North Africa, there is fighting in Asia. When France gets knocked out of the war, Japan will take over Indochina, which is southeastern Asia, in 1940. This is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. They will also, the Thai kingdom, they threatened them, and Thailand, which is one of the very few countries that has never been imperialized or colonized by any other power, basically lets the Japanese go through them to attack British colonies like Malaysia and Siam. They take over Indonesia from the Dutch, who are occupied by the Nazis. And then they attack Papua New Guinea, and of course their biggest target in the southeastern Asian region is Australia, which they bombed several times throughout the war. And meanwhile, they're going to go west from Southeast Asia into Myanmar, and they're going to do the bulk of their fighting in World War II against the British in Myanmar, trying to get to India. And the British and the Indians fighting for the British, because whenever an empire fights, its colonies fight for it, will continue to fight against them. And I think the U.S. gets involved there a little bit. But obviously, so this is the picture that emerges. But this happens actually after Pearl Harbor, that the Japanese declare war on the British and take over these lands. But they've already taken over Southeast Asia, and I believe Indonesia. And it's actually I'm trying to remember his name. Sucro, I think was his name. He is the leader of the one of the resistances of the Indonesians against the Japanese, who will become the first president of an independent Indonesia soon after the war is over. Meanwhile, the resistance against the Japanese in Southeast Asia is strong thanks to the leadership of a Vietnamese man named Ho Chi Minh. Yes, Ho Chi Minh, before he declares independence from the French, before he fights the French and later the Americans in the Vietnam War, he is actually the leader of the resistance, just as Mao is the leader of the Chinese resistance in some ways to the Japanese imperialism in World War II. So, but basically there's a lot going on there, and the United States isn't involved in the war. Now, the main reason the United States is not involved in the war is because it's not because Franklin Roosevelt has any love of Nazis or Japanese imperialism. He has big problems with these things. He sees the existential danger they cause, but he is hampered by two things. One, he is focusing on economic recovery at the end of the Great Depression, which hasn't fully ended. And he is also, secondly, very much in the mindset that these are not necessarily American problems yet. And the Japanese are going to bring the problems to the Americans. Because of the Japanese seizure of Indonesia and Southeast Asia and their activities against all of these regions, particularly against France, and their threats against Britain, and their war crimes in China, the United States sends a warning under Secretary of State Cordell Hull, the Hull warning, that the Japanese basically ignore, and then the U.S. puts an oil embargo in early 1941 on the Japanese. The Japanese need their oil. They need their oil for their planes, for their tanks, for their artillery, for all of these things. And so they are also, by the way, interestingly enough, if I remember correctly, the British and the French did not want to share tank technology with the Japanese. The Japanese got it from the Nazis. Or they got it before that and then used it during the war. But the Japanese were left out of technological loops as well, just a nice aside. Because of the condemnation, because of that resistance, Japan is going to decide that it is going to attack the United States. And this is not a unanimous decision. A lot of people believe that the United States is a danger and could be a threat. The United States obviously helped the Allies tremendously, helped the Japanese, technically speaking, as allies in the First World War. So in the Second World War, what will Japan do against the United States? They don't know how powerful or strong the United States is. The United States has been pretty dormant. Its military has not been a priority as it's struggled with economic recovery. So the Japanese feel that the United States is kind of a militaristic pushover. So on December 7th, 1941, the mission really starts on December 6th, the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. Now, Pearl Harbor is in Hawaii, so they went all the way over to Hawaii, thousands of miles away from their own land, to do this, showing not only their military prowess, but also their reach and their might. Now, this happens out of nowhere. The Americans are not ready for this, and nearly 3,000 American servicemen die. It is the largest attack on American soil until 9/11, and it is the largest military act of war against U.S. soil by a foreign power in its history. When you consider the scale of people who died, unless you want to consider 9/11 an act of war. So the truth of now. The United States had been slowly building up its military and turning production over to these private industries because it realized there might be a threat from Germany and Japan. But obviously, this is a huge action. This shocks a lot of people, and it brings the United States reluctantly into the conflict. Just perhaps equally as famous that day, President Roosevelt gives an address where he says, this day will live in infamy. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, and people who are from that generation may still very well remember. They may be in their 90s, but they very well will probably remember Franklin Roosevelt in all of his charm, charisma, and fortitude saying that the United States had been attacked by Japan and this was a day that would live in infamy. And then once again using his catchphrase, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And the United States starts to mobilize, and it's going to take a while for them to mobilize. And the Japanese are going to attack the British and going to have somewhat of a free hand in Southeast Asia for the foreseeable future. Now, the Japanese success at Pearl Harbor, the surprise attack on the Americans, doesn't sit well with all of the Japanese high command, especially perhaps their greatest naval and air force commander, Admiral Yamamoto, who basically, I'm trying to remember his first name, but Admiral Yamamoto basically tells the Japanese people, he says, we have awoken the sleeping giant. And he was right. He believed it was a bad idea and that it wouldn't necessarily work, and there was truth to what he said. So the Japanese now kind of have a free hand. They can attack Hawaii again, so they start attacking other areas. They take over the Philippines in 1942 and basically make the American soldiers that are left there and the Filipinos who resist them march in what's called the Death Marches of Bataan and then kill all of them. Again, the Japanese are not nice during World War II. No one is nice during war. The idea that war is nice and clean and easy is a completely foreign concept to any history book whatsoever. But in World War II, the Japanese are particularly harsh, and it is always, and I think it just shows how history works, it is almost always overlooked because of the Holocaust, which obviously should never be overlooked at all, but the actions of the Japanese in World War II and the devastation and the horrible things they did is oftentimes left to the side because people are focusing on other things. That's how bad World War II is. There's very few people know about Unit 731. A lot of people, especially if they've studied World War II, know Joseph Mengele. They do not know about Unit 731, probably. So the United States has now joined the conflict, and they are really, really in, and the Japanese are basically doing everything they can before the American machinery and productivity, which will cause them to win the war, catches up. And so because the Americans are not ready, the Japanese have a free hand. They take over Indonesia, or somewhere around then they take over Indonesia. They attack Burma, and they take over the Philippines. And they basically are seizing a bunch of islands in Southeast Asia. They're threatening Papua New Guinea. I think they take Papua New Guinea. They threaten Australia. They threaten New Zealand. And they're going to take small islands in the Pacific from the Americans. Now, the Americans are ill-equipped and move very slow at getting ready to fight against them. But there is a lot going on. There is a lot more going on behind the scenes as the Americans militarize and mobilize and use their productive genius to basically create so exponential amounts of tanks, planes, weaponry, shells, guns, all of that. They are basically at a point where they can outproduce the Germans, Japanese, and Italians combined, and basically win the war. That's how America wins World War II, overproducing. And they're going to outproduce the Japanese, and they're going to out-strategize the Japanese. And obviously the biggest battle will be the biggest next battle in the war will be the Battle of Midway, where basically the U.S., led by several different commanders, is able to surprise the Japanese and defeat them, and keep Midway Island and not let it be destroyed by the Japanese. Midway Island is a very small area, and the Japanese thought if they could take it, that they would be able to then attack Hawaii again. But the Americans are able to withstand them and sink several Japanese carriers, and that is considered a turning point in the War of the Pacific. That and the campaign of Guadalcanal, that was also that year. There is a huge amount of suffering. There's a huge amount of death in the Pacific theater over small islands and small plots of land. Something that World War I always gets criticized for is the Western Front with the trench warfare, where men were dying for inches of land. That kind of happens to some extent during World War II with the Pacific theater because of the American system of island hopping, where basically the Americans will take over one island and get closer and closer to Japan. And this leads to horrible fighting in places like Midway, Guadalcanal, and Iwo Jima. So Japan is now overextending itself to focus on the American threat in the Pacific. This takes them away from the attention away from their activities in China, where the British and the Americans are going to start helping them out. Eventually, the British will invade China, trying to help the Chinese in order to push back on the Japanese military escapades in the South. The fighting will continue in Burma for a couple of years. With the help of the Americans, the Vietnamese rebels will eventually overthrow the Japanese. So Japan's imperial exploits in Asia will be stalled by their continual need to overly commit to their fighting against the Americans in the Pacific theater of the war. With the battle, these battles are just days of fighting. The Japanese are notorious for, like I said, kamikaze, ritual suicide, refusing to surrender, fighting to the last man. They are brutal, they are strong, and they are quick, and they are efficient, and they are extremely good fighters. And it's all the Americans can do to defeat them. And again, the overproductivity of the American military industrial complex is probably what puts the Japanese on the back burner, because the Japanese are not nearly as productive, or they have a lot of industrial faculties, but they do not have as much as the Americans do. So the revenge of a Pearl Harbor attack takes several years, basically, and the Americans push the Japanese back more and more towards Japan. In 1944, they liberate the Philippines. Douglas MacArthur, the American general of the army, had to leave the Philippines a couple years before, saying famously, "I shall return," and then returns and says, "Guess what? I have returned." So meanwhile, of course, the Allies are pushing into Italy with the leadership of Generals Montgomery and Patton. At the same time, in 1944, Dwight Eisenhower leads the invasion at Normandy Beach and the Normandy Campaign, D-Day. So the tide of the war is starting to change. Japan doesn't seem to want to take its foot off the gas at all. It doesn't become any less aggressive, with Italy basically bowing out of the war and only a puppet state in the north being maintained by the Nazis with Mussolini in control. But basically being told by Hitler what he would do and not do. The Japanese might need to see the warning flags, but they have no desire to do that. They start to lose the war in China. And again, after battles like Iwo Jima, it becomes obvious that the Japanese are not going to stop fighting. There is no desire for them to stop fighting, and the war is not going very well for them. Then the firebombing starts. Starting in 1944, 1945, the United States, returning the favor for Pearl Harbor perhaps, start firebombing, and like they did at Dresden, Japanese cities such as Kyoto and Tokyo. And this leads to untold amounts of misery and suffering. Yet the Japanese, under the leadership of Hideki Tojo and the military department, refuse to surrender. So the war continues to be a difficult, a slog for the Americans and a slog for the Japanese. In April of 1945, Hitler kills himself. The Germans surrender 8 days later, and the war in Europe is over. Mussolini is found by the Italians and hung, and now Japan stands alone. Now, a huge part of how the Americans and the British had been able to defeat the Germans and the Italians was the Soviets attacking from the east. The Soviets had not really bothered too much with the Japanese up until this point. Stalin was interested in helping the Allies roundly defeat the Japanese. However, the problem is that he wanted more influence over certain political affairs in Asia. He wanted to have more communist footholds in Asia and Europe, and that was his price to pay for the Americans helping. Now, that wasn't something that was amenable to a lot of Americans, particularly the new U.S. President, Harry Truman, who was staunchly anti-communist. Neither was it amenable to the British Prime Minister, who was slowly but surely on his way out. You may have heard of him. His name is Winston Churchill, and I spent my entire live stream last Sunday talking about his life and legacy, so go back and check that out in my full-length video on him. And if you're enjoying this, consider liking and subscribing, becoming a friendly neighborhood historian. So, anyways, basically, Stalin has a price to pay, and the Americans may have to pay it if they want the Soviets to invade Japan, because as they slowly push more and more northward, they realize that really what's left is the archipelago of Japan, and they might have to invade all of Japan and fight a brutal hand-to-hand combat war. A military invasion of Japan would be far more costly and deadly, perhaps, than one in Germany. So, basically, this is what happens next. Basically, well, actually, in order to go to what happens next, we have to go backwards. In 1939, Actually, it goes back to even before that. A lot of people don't know this. So Werner Heisenberg, who was the creator of quantum mechanics, was hired by the Nazis to create a nuclear weapon, basically, some sort of weapon of mass destruction to be able to use during World War II. And he had worked on it. Albert Einstein, who left Germany because he was a Jew, which I'm surprised a lot of people do not know that Einstein was a Jew. He goes to the United States and he tells President Roosevelt that there is a superweapon in the mix and you need to make one. You need to, again, like you are outproducing them with tanks and guns and shells and artillery, you need to make your own superweapon. And so this leads to the creation of the Manhattan Project under President Roosevelt, where instead of Niels Bohr and Einstein, who aren't really interested in doing it, they turn to another great scientist, Robert J. Oppenheimer, and many of his associates, including Edmund Klemperer and people like this. And they work together and they are able to split the atom and create the atom bomb, working at Los Alamos in New Mexico and Oak Ridge in Tennessee. And they're able to create the first atom bomb and successfully tested in July of 1945. Now, the weapon had originally been intended to use against the Germans if the Germans refused to surrender, but the United States continues working on it because even after the war is over, there's this fear that Japan will not drop out of the conflict, despite the fact that they're clearly disadvantaged, despite the fact that the British and Americans can redouble their efforts and focus everything on them, and despite the fact that it looks like China has finally stabilized and Russia will now join on the side of the Allies in fighting the Japanese, which they really hadn't done before. There's real concern that Japan is in the crosshairs and will face untold amounts of suffering on its native soil, and millions of Japanese people will die with a Soviet, British, and American invasion of Japan. That doesn't mention the fighting that continues in China and probably in Korea as well. So the United States realizes that despite Japan clearly being on the run and in defeat, that they might need to use the weapon designed by Robert Oppenheimer against the Japanese. So there's a famous story of Truman being in meetings with Soviet negotiators about what concessions would be made to the Soviet Union economically and politically in order for them to join the conflict and invade Japan, which they did do. They did take several islands in the northern part of Japan and seize them, I think, in the summer of 1945. But Truman is in these talks, and an aide walks in and tells him that they had the bomb. And Truman ends the talks immediately, says we're finished here, realizing that he could use an atomic weapon, if possible, to wipe the Japanese out. Now, there is no guarantee, and I talked about this on the channel yesterday, that this is going to work. The Japanese military is extraordinarily resilient. No one has ever successfully conquered the Japanese islands. China had tried twice in the 1200s. China had lost twice. Japan is extremely fortified. The people are extraordinary. These are the same patriotic people. When you have been drilling in nationalist and patriotic sympathies and militaristic propaganda for the last 20 years, your people are going to be hardened as rocks and ready to go. So the people, both civilian and military, are ready to fight and die because they believe it is a sign of honor for them to die for their emperor and die for Japan. Not every single Japanese person thinks this, and some Japanese people are obviously concerned, and some have urged caution, like Yamamoto, and realize this war is not worth fighting. Emperor Hirohito seems to think this as well, but that doesn't stop Tojo and the other Japanese leadership from continuing to drill home the idea of propaganda against the West and this noble effort of the Japanese people to continue fighting this war to the very last man. Now, here's the problem. The Japanese are gripping, fortifying, getting ready for a land invasion. They don't think the Americans and the British and the Russians can really successfully invade them. They are cornered, however, and at the same time, they think that they can keep this war going, and if they have to sacrifice their nation, basically, they will, to some extent. So, but the Americans are faced with a difficult decision now. The Japanese are arming their civilians with sharp stakes, ready to fight hand-to-hand combat, as they had in the jungles of all of these islands, in order to defeat the American invaders. So, that's a big problem. You're facing hand-to-hand combat. You're facing a nasty invasion of the islands. You're facing hundreds of thousands of lives lost, militarily, and millions of Japanese lives lost potentially, and who knows what is going to happen. You're facing all of these things, and you have two choices. So President Truman decides, instead of a slow death, a slow fight that would continue, that would probably cost more life, he decides on using the atomic weapons. They have three, and I believe they call it Fat Man, Little Boy, or something like that. They use the first one on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, which, if I'm correct, is semi-military, semi-civilian, not necessarily not a military zone exactly. And on August 6th, they launch it. Huge day in history. Blows up, destroys the city, causes tens of thousands of immediate deaths, levels the city, and tens of thousands more will die from cancer, radiation, burns, exposure, all sorts of horrible things, and consequences and aftermath results of that over the next few the next few days, weeks, months, and years. So it's extraordinarily awful. It's a terrible result. You have the loss of huge amounts of life, and the Japanese military does not want to surrender. This is far worse than the firebombing. This is instant death. This is instant destruction. This is what Oppenheimer said, "I have become death, the destroyer of worlds." This is horrifying. And the Japanese have not surrendered yet. So a few days later, the Americans launch another nuclear weapon at Nagasaki, which is a little smaller, but still causes the deaths of tens of thousands of people in an instant, in a flash. All of his life gone. You don't get that from a land invasion. That is the moral weight of the use of nuclear weapons, as opposed to a land invasion that would have that slow burn of tens of thousands of deaths. And there was no guarantee, A, the Japanese would surrender after the use of the bombs, or B, the Japanese wouldn't surrender after the land invasion proved somewhat successful. Who knows how long the Japanese would have kept it going if a land invasion had worked? Who knows if they could have surrounded the island and forced them into submission? But there seemed to be no other way that didn't cause far more suffering and untold losses of life, at least in the mind of President Truman. So the Japanese military is still anchoring for a fight, but now it is the emperor's turn. The emperor, who has the ability to speak to the people, comes on the radio famously and declares two incredible things. A, he is not a god, so stop fighting and worshiping him. Stop fighting for and worshiping him. And B, he wants the Japanese to surrender. And he still carries enough clout and weight, despite abandoning any idea of godship and divinity, in order to lead the Japanese to surrender. And surrender they do. MacArthur and the Americans occupy the islands, and there is the famous picture with MacArthur next to Tojo. I believe Tojo was put on trial and executed for treason. For war crimes, next to Hirohito, and they show that Hirohito is a small man and that MacArthur is this big, strong American, and America starts to recreate the Japanese political structure, economic structure, and Japan's military is cut down. And until recently, the United States has basically said that Japan cannot have a military. The United States will take care of its military issues. There are military bases in Japan run by the United States. And for 8 years after the war, the United States occupies Japan and uses it as their base of operations for the Korean War. So basically, that's what we're left with at this point. We've got that's where the war ends in September of 1945. The final treaties are signed. The 8 years of Japan will be a big part of the Cold War. It'll be a big democratic ally of the United States in Asia. They will actually eventually elect to keep the emperor in power. So there is still a Japanese emperor. I think it's Torato or something is his name. He's the emperor today. The Japanese still have an emperor, but he's a figurehead with no power, similar to not queen, they don't have a queen anymore, the King of England. And that is where Japan stands now in the 2020s. Obviously, a lot has changed in 80 years, but that modern political structure of Japan is set up by the occupation of the United States and by using Japan as their base of operations during the Cold War in East Asia, especially during the Korean War. Nathan, I think it did. There is relief and rebuilding of Japan, but it's a completely separate plan than the Marshall Plan, which rebuilds Europe at the end of World War II. So that's a very good question. But basically, that is a short history of Japan in World War II. Tried to do as much of it from the Japanese perspective as possible, looking at Pearl Harbor from the Japanese perspective, why they did Pearl Harbor, why they got involved in the war, why they attacked the British. colonies, why they attacked the Americans. And basically, it all goes back to this desire to be the greatest and most powerful empire in the world and have this influence, and to be recognized where they had not been recognized at the end of World War One, and to get revenge against the Western powers for underestimating them, seizing their imperial lands, taking over their colonies, and also doing everything in their power that they possibly can do to thwart the Americans for thwarting them. And because the Americans got in their way, if anyone got in Japan's way, they were going to make sure they paid that. And the Americans, surprisingly, were able to make them pay. So that is exactly. I've tried to give as much of the Japanese perspective and attitude about World War II as I possibly can. There's a short synopsis here. Yeah. Yeah. But basically, I hope you liked and enjoyed that lecture about Japan and its efforts in World War II, why it fought World War II, what it did in World War I, what it did in the interwar years, and how it tried to take over Asia, and how it was almost successful. I mean, seems hindsight. I mean, America was going to win because of its productivity and everything. There was no guarantee that Japan would stop fighting after the bombs. There was one more bomb. Who knows if the Japanese knew that or not? It doesn't sound like they did. They didn't want the Americans to keep doing this. That's why they were able to surrender. But at the same time, the United States, a few years before that, Japan had basically knocked out French colonies in Asia, were threatening all the British colonies in Asia, and had taken over America's colony, the Philippines, in Asia, as well as Guam as well, which the Americans owned. So the Japanese had really put the United States and the Western world on watch through their power and aggressiveness. And that is why the United States punishment of Japan was so severe as to include, basically, we will take care of your military issues. You are not allowed to have a military anymore. But basically the Americans bought hegemony and influence over Japan through economic investment, and Japan is going to become extremely economically poignant throughout the rest of the 20th century, a huge trading partner of the United States. I mean, the most popular and powerful and probably best cars in America are Japanese in origin to a large extent. So Toyota is probably the most reliable car brand in the United States. So Japan really has an interesting change to becoming more of an economic and technological juggernaut in the later part of the 20th century than it does in the first half, which was being a military juggernaut. So, but basically, that is where the live stream lecture stops. We're going to go for another half an hour and do Q&A about different historical topics. So this is the time where if you want to ask or submit any questions or comments about any historical topics or questions about what we just talked about here with Japan and World War II, feel free to do so, and I will answer them in as best a manner as I can. I'm going to scroll up because I saw some questions earlier. But if you have enjoyed what you have learned, please consider liking and subscribing, joining that legion, as Simon calls it, of friendly neighborhood historians. Yeah, we are doing our best to have a good time and get as many people as we possibly can on board. And yeah, consider liking and subscribing and dropping any questions, comments, ideas you have in the chat, because I really want to hear them and I really want to talk about it. And I'm sure you guys have some stuff to say and ask about Japan. I don't know why Mao did not brush his teeth. I don't know. Maybe he saw that as a capitalist thing. We want to talk about decolonization. So decolonization is actually a very good connection to World War II, because decolonization happens in many ways because of World War II. The United States, because it wants to appear friendly to democracy and independence, which it isn't always, but at least wants to appear that way, puts pressure on Britain and France to give colonial autonomy and independence to their colonies after World War II. Now, I had a live stream lecture about Churchill and all the great things he did during World War II last week. I made a video about it. Did we not get to the Churchill second parter? Oh my goodness, we forgot the Churchill second parter. But I'm going to have to save that for another time. But basically, I can kind of say it now. I did a lot on Churchill basically today, indirectly. Churchill spent most of World War II prompting the Americans about what to do. He tries to get them to invade Norway. That doesn't go well. He pushes for the invasion of Italy, thinking that'll knock them out of the war. That doesn't work. But he also, it's one of the biggest travesties of Churchill's legacy is not the Gallipoli offensive that went wrong in World War I. It is that he actually starved the Indians in order to take as much food from India and give it to the British during the war as possible. So there was a famine in India that was probably caused by Churchill's actions, similar with I think 1 million to 2 million Indians dying in the 1940s because of that. And a lot of people do not talk about that, or Churchill's racist attitudes towards a lot of people who were not Westerners, his social Darwinian views of people groups. But basically, Churchill was a huge opponent of decolonization, and believed that basically that India owed its loyalty and fealty to the British for keeping them safe, and that Britain made everywhere it went better. And Churchill had this attitude since he was a war reporter, correspondent, and cavalryman in the 1890s and early 1900s. And that was just who Churchill was, and and you have to take that along with understanding the successes of getting Britain through the Battle of Britain and through World War II. Churchill was rewarded, by the way, at the end of World War II by losing his office to Clement Attlee, a socialist Labour Party member. He goes into retirement and then returns to power in the early 50s and becomes the mentor and best friend to Elizabeth II. And basically, whenever Churchill is not in power, he's riding and touring around the world. He is the one who, at the beginning of the Cold War, gives the famous Iron Curtain speech, where he says an Iron Curtain has descended across Eastern Europe, where communism has basically taken control of these lands and will try to control them forever. And basically drawing the line to show the division between Western and Eastern Europe, as he actually is supposed to have done at the Yalta Conference in 1945 with Roosevelt and Stalin. He drew the line between Korea, separating Korea from North and South, allowing the communists to have occupy the North and the U.S. and the Allies to occupy the South after they defeated Japan. So that's something interesting that you might not have known. But basically, Churchill was against colonization because he was against the fall of the British Empire. And decolonization is popular with the Americans because it makes them seem more democratic, fair, and altruistic. And the communist argument against the West is that they are imperialists and that they are colonizers, and that they are evil because of this, and that they have spread capitalism by force. And the United States wants to export capitalism, at least ostensibly, through peaceful means, and so they put pressure on the British and the French to grant independence to their African and Asian colonies, which they do. There is this co-op work of the decolonization process that the British in particular set in place, and it's not always a smooth transition. Some places it's not always a great government that takes over. You have the power vacuum in Zimbabwe will lead to Robert Mugabe's dictatorship that will cost untold suffering in Zimbabwe. The French refuse to let go of Algeria, so they fight an 8-year war, with Ho Chi Minh declaring independence of Vietnam, not just from Japan, but from France in 1945. France goes in to reassert its authority. It has a 9-year war there that they lose badly as well. The French do let West Africa go, similar to how the British will let places like South Africa, Kenya, and Ghana get their independence. But it's a slow process, and the decolonized countries are supposed to have Western influence and ideas. A lot of them reject Western influence and ideas because they see them as the reason for their suffering, and that causes their inability to want to form their tribal problems, cultural problems, linguistic differences, which were all because the Europeans divided up the land according to how they wanted to colonize them. This comes back to haunt them as they become independent nations, because all these African countries have all sorts of fighting and disagreement, power vacuums, kleptocracies, the rise of militaristic factions that want to control everything. This is seen in Egypt with the rise of Gamal Abdel Nasser. It happens in Rwanda, obviously, eventually with the rise of Idi Amin. That happened. So that's a little bit on decolonization. There are power vacuums, and a lot of times they are filled by authoritarian regimes, be they communist, like in Vietnam or North Korea, or they are filled with military dictatorships, like you see in places like Rwanda and Zimbabwe. So just a little bit on decolonization there. It's a process, and it hasn't really worked, and it's not fully the Europeans' fault, but it is partly their fault. And obviously they set up the system in the first place and then were hesitant to let it go. The British a little less so, but still. So, Nathan, were there moral debates in Washington before dropping the bomb? Yes, there were some moral debates there. So a lot of people thought that dropping the bomb was not a moral decision and that it was but at the end of the day, it's probably more of a utilitarian moral decision based on what is the estimated cost of destruction, damage, and loss of life. And ethics stop. Yeah, that could be true. Yep, Raul, I just talked about that. Suez Canal crisis. Yeah, that's a great example of decolonization. But basically what happens is Nasser wants to nationalize all the industries in Egypt, including the Suez Canal. The French who built it and use it and the British who own it don't want that to happen. And this leads to a war. Israel is going to fight against the Egyptians because they know that Egypt wants Israel to be wiped off a map at this point. And so it's going to be a conflict. And the United States is actually going to support the Egyptians holding on to the Suez Canal. And the Egyptians are able to withstand the Europeans and Israelis and keep the Suez. Yeah, that could be true. And who does? Yes, you did hear South Africa, and South Africa is an example of a country that was decolonized, that had a lot of struggles in that decolonization not because of the British, but because of the Dutch and the apartheid regime that was set up there. But South Africa is struggling to find its economic footing, but it is doing better because of its natural resources and large population compared to other European countries, or sorry, African countries, like for instance Kenya or Chad. What was it that was it the Viet Minh that was the independent movement in Indochina? I don't know. I think it is the Viet Minh is what it was called. And then later that evolved into the Viet Cong that fights against South Vietnam's military dictatorships during the Vietnam War. Well, I don't live in the past, but I use the past to help me live in the present. So hopefully that helps, Bada. I'm so glad you are here. Bienvenue, Bada. What heinous accusation? I'm interested in these heinous accusations. Yeah, there are some very cool British guys out there, Lola, to be sure. I'm going through the chat right now. If you have a question or comment or topic you want to discuss, drop it in the chat and I will answer it in a timely manner. I'm trying to go. We have a Bosnian in the chat. That's really cool. I'm trying to go through it in linear order and get as much as I possibly can. And yes, we will be back Friday and Saturday for the live stream Q&A. I'm going to take a winter break, probably the week of Christmas, but I'll be back the week of New Year's just to just avoid the live streams. I might not even post anything, just take time off because I've been working a lot on this channel, doing a lot of extra stuff, including in addition to my normal routines. But let me see here, just going through the chat, seeing some stuff. Let me see here. Some interesting talks. Oh, we had Michaela. I hope you're still here, Michaela, from Ireland. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're just on the anniversary, just past it, of Irish independence. Oh, yes. People were asking about Oppenheimer. Oppenheimer might be my favorite historical movie because they were asking about my favorite historical movie. It is so good. It's not fully, completely accurate like any historical movie. There's a lot of dramatization, but it's a really interesting, but it's a brilliant take on what happened. Let me see here. I don't think FDR would have used, maybe he would and maybe he wouldn't. He did commission them to be built. And I don't know what he would have done instead. That's an interesting thing. Would FDR have used the nukes against the Japanese? He obviously, and this is something we didn't talk about in the live stream lecture, FDR obviously didn't have a problem with interning hundreds of thousands of them. It was him who did that. Franklin Roosevelt is often considered in a lot of people's minds to be one of America's greatest presidents, and I think that's absolute nonsense. I think he was a good president, but I think he's highly overrated, and I think he did a lot of things that no one ever holds him accountable for. His economic program did not solve the Great Depression. In fact, many believe that it perpetrated it even further. The internment of the Japanese, he refused to pass anti-lynching legislation. FDR, he was a philanderer. I mean, he isn't as good of a person as his speeches make him look, which shows his cult of personality. But Roosevelt probably wouldn't have done that, but he didn't hesitate to make Japanese people suffer. Hundreds of thousands of them were in camps where the Italians and Germans got slaps on the wrist for being Italian and German Americans during the war, showing just how much that racist attitude had gone, that racist attitude to begin with that had put the Japanese in this place where they hated the West and where they wanted to get even with the West. That attitude was displayed when Roosevelt interned the Japanese, hundreds of thousands of them, but not the millions of German and Italian Americans who had been immigrating much longer and had a much longer tradition in America than the Japanese did. The fear that they were spies, these Japanese people, led to horrible suffering, people being sent to camps. They weren't concentration camps, people weren't suffering and dying there, but they were basically, they lived there and they couldn't leave. George Takei from Star Trek lived there. Hundreds of thousands of them. Manzanar is one of the most well-known ones. Many of them in Northern California. They were processed because most of them lived on the West Coast. So really terrible stuff. And that meant their businesses, their property, their livelihood, their money, that was all taken, stolen, and lost from them during that time, by the way. So it led to untold amounts of suffering. So let me see here, just going through the chat. Some of these talks are interesting. Yes, Caleb, Albert Einstein was a jerk and a philanderer. That is very true. So if I'm going to criticize FDR for that, I'll criticize him and Kennedy, and a lot of people in history have been philanderers. Yeah, it might have been costly to the Japanese that Germany got rid of Einstein. But again, he's a Jew, and he was in danger. And I think Niels Bohr was a Jew, too, and that's why he fled. When did the Japanese camps end? I think after the war, maybe right before the war ended. Oh, Magnus, great to see you. I'm glad you're here. The Great White Fleet, Kelly. I don't know what the Great White Fleet was. Jog my memory. Maybe I've heard of it and I just don't know what it's called. Why did the Hudson Bay Company need such a big ship like the Nosage for beaver fur? Because they wanted to, it was about storing as much beaver fur as they possibly could. And the Hudson Bay Company, the British love to use their fur, and they love to build big ships, and they love to be intimidating, but they also love to have as much space for as much cargo as possible. And the beaver trade was huge in the northwestern areas, particularly in the northwestern Pacific Northwest and in Canada. For instance, Oregon is called the Beaver State. Oregon is the home of the beavers because the beaver, during the 1830s and 40s, that land was duly occupied by the United States and Great Britain. What is now Idaho, Washington, Oregon, and British Columbia were all kind of, the Americans and the British lived in it as an autonomous region, and they hunted beaver furs, and beaver skins and beaver pelts and beaver meat were extraordinarily popular during the first half of the 19th century. Thank you for subscribing, Bada. Merci beaucoup. Yeah, fought the law. So basically, in that, after World War II, as Churchill talked about in his speech, you got the division of the Iron Curtain, and you have Eastern Europe and its communist governments, which are basically selected and handpicked by Moscow to some extent. And you have the West that are free democracies, where basically the United States, through rebuilding efforts called the Marshall Plan, is able to exert a huge amount of cultural and political influence over those regions. And in 1949, they're going to unite in a mutual defense and economic pact called NATO that will include Canada, Greenland, Britain, France, West Germany, because Germany is now divided. Germany is occupied during World War II, and there's zones. There's a French zone, which is very small because France didn't do much during the war. There's a British and an American, and across the way there's a Soviet one. The same thing in the city of Berlin. So Berlin is divided as a city, and Germany is divided as a country during what becomes known as the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, where there's no actual fighting, but there's continual political skirmishing, technological skirmishing, and proxy wars being fought in places like Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Korea. So the Warsaw Pact is anything the Americans did, the Soviets had to do, and anything the Soviets had to do, the Americans had to do, and they had to do it better. And the Warsaw Pact was formed in the 50s as the answer to NATO, as Comecon, C-O-M-E-C-O-N, was formed as the way to rebuild Eastern Europe and create a communist reliance on communist government by the Soviets, as opposed to it's the opposite of the Marshall Plan. The Book of Enoch, a famous book, it's adopted by the Ethiopian Church, Coptic Christian Church, is a scriptural book, and it discusses the role of giants in the ancient Canaanite world and the ancient Levant in Israel. Seth, I'm sorry that I didn't get to say goodbye to you, but I'm so glad to see you. Seth is one of our longtime listeners who always comes by and has some great things to ask and talk about, and I really appreciate it. If you want to become a friendly neighborhood historian, be like Seth. Seth comes to the live streams, he asks questions, he watches the videos, he comments, he gives topics, and he listens to the lectures. Be like Seth. Like, subscribe, become a friendly neighborhood historian. It's as easy as that. Yeah. Let me see here. Niffin, did World War II affect Jim Crow and civil rights in any way? Yes, I would say that it did. I think it got the ball rolling in a fervor way. The civil rights movement really starts to become even more prominent. It was already nascent, but it becomes more prominent after World War II. Truman desegregating the military because you have black soldiers fighting for the Americans and dying for the Americans, and yet look at how they're treated back in their own land. And you can't condemn Nazi hatred of different races like the Slavs and the Jews if you're not willing to look at the mirror and look at your own hatred and discrimination, and the Nuremberg laws and certain things that had discriminated against the Jews and other groups, ethnic groups in Germany particularly, and what the Japanese had done against the Chinese. You can condemn that for the violence, but you don't have the best record to stand on. So I think there was a reflective mirror put on the Americans, and there was also this feeling of more contribution and the more need to recognize those contributions by African Americans during the war. He fought in a war in Namibia. Very interesting. I didn't know there was a war in Namibia. I shouldn't say Namibia. Namibia. Let me see. Why did all the green dye back in the day have arsenic in it? I don't know. Actually, Caleb, I know a lot, but I don't know that. We know that Coca-Cola had cocaine in it. Let me see here. Going through the chat. I've been on the non-such because it's in the museum in my city. It's the real ship. Interesting. I've never seen a picture or a diagram of it. I would have to take a picture of it. I'd have to look at it. France did have some problems with NATO because France basically didn't want the United States running everything. Yep, there are in the southeast. The southeast of where? It all depends where you're coming from, common sense. Did World War II have an effect on? Yeah, I answered that one. 1907 to 1999, I believe, was the time frame of the Great White Fleet circumnavigation of the globe. Oh yeah, I've heard of this fleet. Yes, did they go to the North Pole? I think they went to the North Pole or Antarctica. Hello, welcome. What do I think about Russia? Well, I am a Russian historian. That is my emphasis. As Simon pointed out, my wonderful moderator, Simon the Bunny, show him some love in the chat if you haven't already. But basically, yeah, Russian history is my emphasis. So if you have anything you would like to discuss, I think it's a fascinating place, an amazing country with a lot of great culture and history that is very, very interesting because of its liminal stage between Europe and the rest of Asia. Yeah, you're probably thinking of, there was a little bit of rebellion. The Americans, some of them, like George S. Patton, wanted to invade the Soviet Union at the end of World War II. Churchill, as a matter of fact, wanted to invade the Soviet Union in World War I at the end and make sure they didn't become communists. That didn't work either time or didn't happen. The truth of the matter is that basically, there was some revolution and talk of uprising, and Stalin wasn't having any of it. The next biggest revolution was the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, where the Hungarians begged the United States to help them overthrow the communists, and the United States ignored them. Yeah. And yes, please come back to the Q&A Friday. Start your weekend off right, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time with some Q&A, live stream. Ask questions, comments, topics, ask me anything you want about social studies, social sciences, geopolitics, past and present history. That's what we do here, geography, politics, and we do that on Saturdays as well. Yep, Max Upois, I'm so glad you're here. I'm saying that right. It's very late, yes. Oh, you lived in Vladivostok on the eastern coast. Fascinating, right there by Manchuria, right where all of this happened. Yes, that sounds about right. There was racial tension. Well, you have desegregated units, it makes sense. Kaliningrad, very nice. So you're in the western part of Russia. Friendly neighbor, this is quite a challenge. How do genocidal victims or perpetrators and their descendants do that? What do you mean? Bada, I like your question, but I'm not sure what you mean by it. Friendly neighbor historian. This is quite a challenge. How do genocidal victims or perpetrators and their descendants do that? How do they live? How do they deal with that? There's a lot of trauma. They've got this in Holocaust documentaries and documentaries about other victims of mass genocide where there's generational trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, need for counseling and intervention, alcoholism, domestic emotional abuse, all sorts of things. Struggles. It's very hard. Yeah, the Great White Fleet was a nickname for a large fleet of naval warships. Oh, yes, that probably is a result of the building of the Panama Canal. the United States wanting to show its influence everywhere. I've heard a little bit about this, but basically that was the speak softly and give it, and which is the speak softly and carry a big stick. Teddy Roosevelt's idea that you use your military, particularly your navy, to show as much influence and power over the world as you can. The childhood home of Himmler. That's kind of eerie. They are descended from Vikings, Slavs, Turks, and all sorts of people who have conquered and occupied that region. Eastern Europeans. It's quite fascinating. Why did Russia abandon Assad? I don't think that Russia has the military fortitude. They need North Koreans to come and help them fight their war right now in Ukraine. I think they don't have the ability to extend themselves like the Japanese did in World War II. That didn't go well. The Germans did in World War I. That didn't go well. I don't think Russia's about to do that in their Russia-Ukrainian war. But they have given full asylum to Bashar al-Assad. I knew as soon as his government fell, this is a historic day, because when this happened, it happened last night here in the United States, but it was technically this day, the 8th in Syria, when Assad's government fell. So this is a historic day in the nation of Syria and in their history, the end of the Assad regime, perhaps the end of dictatorial regime in Syria. Who knows what the new rebel government will look like, but basically, Russia didn't have the fortitude to do that, and Assad's government has fallen, and who knows what Syria will look like. The last major dictator of the 2000s in that region is gone. Interesting, Ukrainian. That's really fascinating, from Kazakhstan. And there were a lot of Russians who were relocated during the Soviet times, particularly under Stalin, from Eastern Europe to Kazakhstan. Underboss, great to see you. So glad you're here. There's a huge mix. There's Scandinavians too, Nordic peoples, yes. From Norway, Otak, great to see you. I think I've seen you before. I'm so glad to see you. We have people come in from all over the world, from Finland and from Norway, from Sweden. We have people. We have people from Russia, Kazakhstan, China, Japan, India. It's always great to see everybody here. Stephen, you probably do. That would be my guess. And the Vikings raided England and the British Isles a lot, so Ireland would be part of that. So you've probably got some of that. Might your views on Israel change in the next decade? It might. I don't know. I don't see it changing anytime soon. Hello, good to see you. Excuse me. Chinese Civil War. So the Chinese Civil War I talked about it a little bit during the lecture on Japan, but basically the Chinese Civil War is bracketed. It happens in the 1920s and early 30s, and it looks like the Chinese communists have fully lost and been defeated by the nationalists, and Mao is forced to regroup and go to the northeast to Manchuria, and then the Civil War starts as soon as World War II ends. So during the Second Sino-Japanese War, the communists and nationalists had united to fight the Japanese. Once the Japanese were defeated, the Chinese Civil War resumed. This time, the communists were far stronger, far more militarily supported, especially by the Soviets, and they were able to defeat the nationalists. And by 1949, the nationalists had fled to Taiwan, Formosa, and Mao establishes the People's Republic. But basically, the nationalists, just like the White Russians in the Russian Civil War, destroying the lands of the peasants, forcing the peasants into conscriptive service, abusing the peasants, which many Chinese people were peasants, led the peasants into the lap of supporting Mao and the Red communists in China. So, that's a little bit about this Chinese Civil War. Talking about war history. We talk about all types of history, and war is a big part of history, so yeah, there's a lot of war history. I am good. I hope you are well as well. Historia. My great-grandfather was on a corvette ship in World War II, and my other great-grandfather is currently 100. Well, God bless him, 104 years. That's amazing. Yes, Bashar al-Assad, the longtime dictator who has ruled over Syria as his father did. It's been 24 years. He called himself the president, but his elections are all rigged and stuff like that. A longtime opponent of the United States, a huge supporter of Iran, and a giant critic of Israel, has fallen in power. He is also a close ally of President Erdogan of Turkey and of Vladimir Putin's government in Russia. He has been facing continual revolution in his country for the last 10 years, thanks to the Arab Spring and the efforts of the Obama administration. and Assad has used chemical weapons. He is responsible for the deaths of about 500,000 Syrian people during his regime, and his regime seemed to be stabilized in the last few years. However, a sudden burst by the rebels, who are supported by the United States and the West, have led to the fall of his government, as they took Aleppo just a week ago, and now have basically the Syrian army has abandoned its posts, and Assad has been forced to flee. So yes, very interesting there. And now there's a power vacuum in Syria, and we'll see who emerges from that. From Sweden, great to see you. We just talked about Sweden. Serbian, what do you think about Serbians? I think the Serbians are an extremely important people with a very fascinating history, and I think they have been bullied way too much by greater powers like the Ottomans, and then the Russians, and then the Austro-Hungarians. Support world peace? We all do. I think a lot of people support world peace, but I think a lot of people who support world peace are taken advantage of, unfortunately, by people who don't support world peace. And I think sometimes peace is a result of, like Teddy Roosevelt, speak softly and carry a great stick. Speak softly, be peaceful, be reasonable, advocate for world peace, advocate for ending world hunger, for ending global warming, for doing all of these wonderful things. But at the same time, carry a big stick, be ready to fight, be ready to have something military to back it up. I think that strategy has proven to work in the past. What's my favorite historical movie? I think Oppenheimer probably takes it. Braveheart's up there. Although these are not 100% accurate, obviously, they are very, very good historical movies. Interesting. So I'm catching up on the chat here. If you like what you're hearing, consider liking and subscribing, becoming a friendly neighborhood historian. We're going to be finishing up in the next 5 minutes, but we have been doing an hour and a half, an hour of live stream lecture on the history of Japan in World War II, and we also wrapped up the Churchill stuff, but we're also doing Q&A. So yes. Oh, let me see here. Randall Flagg, From the Stand by Stephen King, one of my favorite books. Oh, I'm muted? Uh-oh. Uh-oh, that's been bad. Okay, I don't know when I last got muted, or was the last thing you heard me. I'm sorry about that. That happens occasionally. I hate when it happens. What was the last thing you guys heard me say? I'm back. Let me see here. Okay, yeah, I'm back. Let me see. What was the last thing anyone? Yeah, I was deeply answering. I was saying my favorite cuisine. Somebody asked about favorite cuisines. I was saying French, Indian, uh, Italian, Mexican, like all good Americans. I love Mexican food, Chinese, stuff like that. Um, stuff like that. Okay, so about 3 minutes ago. So it wasn't that bad. It was a short lapse. But Schindler's List, Simon mentioned, is a great historical movie. So please check that out. Of course, I like Norway. I'm reading the chat, but I'm not reading it as it comes. I'm scrolling down, so I didn't see that the mute was happening until Simon pointed that out. And people do start wars over politics and philosophy and religion, but I think that's a cover for just power and greed. Colors and flags. I don't know. There's a lot of good history around the colors and flags, but I don't know exactly the reason for that. So, but there's common colors that appear in flags normally, and sometimes that's going to look one way or the other, like other flags. A lot of flags are very similar. The French and Russian flag are extraordinarily similar, and they're similar to the U.S. flag, right? Red, white, and blue. So now, fortunately, yeah, but now that you can hear me, maybe you're getting the truth nuggets again. There is good, yeah, all American food, Simon, is basically from other cultures. So pizza is Italian, sushi is Japanese, tacos are Mexican, burritos are American, chop suey is American, but they're made by immigrants from obviously Mexico and China, respectively. So yeah, there are many great foods in America. Where were the carriers? There were two main battleships. There weren't that many carriers. America did not have as many as the Japanese they would pick up in production later on. I believe they had one, and they had the Oklahoma and Arizona that were sunk. Those are battleships. They caught up with carriers throughout World War II. So, let me see here. Thank you, Underboss. I appreciate you pushing the channel. If you're enjoying what I've talked about and actually are what you can actually hear me say, please like and subscribe. I hope everybody heard what I was saying about Assad and the fall of Syria. That is extraordinarily interesting. Iran was involved in that. Russia was involved in that. They wanted Assad to stay in power, but it looks like that's finally over. What history you show off, bro? All history show you, bro. Yeah, you clearly spend a lot of time working on saying bro and not a lot of time focusing on grammar. So, yeah, they did, I believe, and the Germans conquered it, and the British tried to recapture it. Hitler tried to attack it, and it did not work. So, yes, we would love, yes, make sure Simon's dreams are fulfilled, and you guys like and subscribe, monetize the channel so that Simon and I can retire easily. But we're at our 90-minute mark, which is where we said we would be. When do we have this on your channel? So we have a live stream Q&As Friday and Saturday. Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern, Saturdays at 7 p.m. Eastern, and Sunday is the live stream lecture. I'm just doing an extra half hour because we missed our live stream lecture on Friday for our live stream Q&A on Friday. So I did an extra half hour of Q&A, but usually it's just a lecture on a historical topic, and that's Sundays starting at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I see. I'm sorry, Luke. Please get help. So. Yes, of course. I'm glad you guys got what I said about Assad. I love talking about current geopolitics because it's all connected to the history of the region. Yes, you definitely could. You can scan a credit card too. Just know I don't take Discover. I'm on the U.S. I don't usually keep where I don't reveal a lot about my personality and stuff like that. People learned my height yesterday. They know a couple of different things about me, but they don't know a lot. But if anyone has any other questions on any other historical topics, social sciences, things like that, please be sure to drop them in the chat. Yes, Friday, 7 p.m. Okay, so I've got to switch those. Thank you, Simon. I do need to do that. Thank you for reminding me. Yeah, I mean, I love everyone who comes to the live, and I enjoy it, and I just watch the channel grow, and it's a slow but steady process. I mean, when we first started doing these live stream Q&As, we only did it once, then we expanded out to do them twice, and then 3 times because a lot of people liked them and wanted to ask more questions. And I did the live stream lectures because the topics I wanted to talk about in the Q&A and get questions about, I couldn't get to it because so many people had so many great questions. So we've been growing a lot, and it's not a marathon, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon, and it's a process. And so if I don't get 150, 200 people in the live stream, I don't get mad about it. I don't get mad when I have 5 people. I mean, sometimes we have thousands, sometimes we have hundreds. My hope is to grow, and as we grow, more and more people will come, more and more faces, more and more new people, more and more effects on the algorithm, all of that stuff. Excuse me. So I'm not too worried, but thank you, Simon. I appreciate what you're saying. What was yesterday, smart guy? Luke, if you had come to the live stream lecture earlier, you would know that I am talking about the anniversary of Pearl Harbor, and I gave an entire history about it from the Japanese perspective because yesterday was the 84th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack, the largest military attack on U.S. soil, unless you want to consider 9/11 a military attack, where nearly 3,000 American servicemen died in Pearl Harbor Bay in Hawaii, on the Big Island, which led to the United States getting involved in World War II, and the Nazis and the Italians declaring war on them soon afterwards. So take a look at the channel, take a look at my videos. I have a full-length video on World War II. I have a full-length video on Churchill. I've talked a lot about this stuff, and yes, I am a smart guy. Thank you so much for calling me that. I appreciate you, Luke. They had a warning. They didn't know for sure. I'm not sure. Is a dog more powerful than a mouse? Probably. Let me see here. Thank you, Simon, for taking care of the chat and keeping everybody from spamming. Let me see. I think we've got our last questions here. Was Hitler evil due to the fact he was inbred, or was it he was just an unlucky random thing that had nothing to do with being inbred? No, it had nothing to do with breeding. It was because of anti-Semitic ideas mixed with authoritarianism, mixed with the inability to accept the loss of World War I, and an inability to give up national pride and take responsibility. So lack of accountability, victim mentality, and obviously anti-Semitism and hatred, which I believe all anti-Semitism, all hatred, all racism come from a lack of understanding of history and culture, and also an unwillingness to take responsibility for your own actions, successes, or failures. Those are all what caused Hitler to do this. Racists also definitely get timed out. Thank you so much, Simon. I like you too. Thank you so much. This live stream was about you might want to go back and watch the recording of it, Chloe, but this live stream was about the history of Pearl Harbor and World War II from the Japanese perspective. We do this every Sunday, and Fridays and Saturdays is a live stream Q&A, and I didn't have one on Friday, so I gave it an extra time here at the end to answer questions. So Chloe, if you like learning about history, social studies, geopolitics, and anyone else out there who likes learning about this stuff, consider liking and subscribing, becoming a friendly neighborhood historian. The goal is 6,000, a legion, but a legion of friendly neighborhood historians, nothing violent. Thank you, Jeb Fla. I really appreciate that. Do you think the Native American tribes would have developed like the European? No. No. Every civilization and culture develops differently. That's no animus about the Native Americans, Captain Kirk. Nothing at all. I really, really don't think that there was that development. The Chinese were developing differently, the Middle Easterns, the Africans, all these peoples developed differently because of cultural practices. And by that point, they had not developed that way. Most of them did not have a wheeled civilization. I'm not saying that they're bad for that. I'm saying that they're different, and I don't see them developing the same way. That's interesting. Yep. Well, we haven't gone 50 minutes over. Well, we went 50 minutes over because I was 20 minutes late. So there we go. But we did do the 30-minute Q&A, and we went a few minutes over. So, interesting. Yeah, I've heard that conspiracy theory that Hitler and some of the Nazis, a lot of Nazis, Mengele, who I talked about earlier in his horrible experiments, similar to the Japanese Unit 731 activities on the Chinese POWs, Mengele lived the rest of his life in South America. Adolf Eichmann was in South America when the Israeli Mossad tracked him down and killed him in the 1960s. This is common stuff. I don't think that happened to Adolf Hitler, though. There's just too much noise and information with the Jews hunting down Eichmann. They would have definitely hunted down Hitler. One Adolf was less so than the other. Ethiopian. Great to see you, Kadesset. One of the most ancient Christian kingdoms in the world, one of the few areas not to be colonized by the Europeans, and the ancient kingdoms of Askim found their home in Ethiopia. I don't know how they would have developed, to be sure. I think there would have been some level of development. But I think that a lot of the Native Americans were, and you can't say Native Americans specifically in one way or another because the Native Americans were different. I think that there was more development and cultivation in Central and South America by the Aztecs, Mayas, Toltecs, and Incas, as opposed to North America, which had these kind of more spread out itinerant. There was a lot of nomadic peoples and Bedouinic groups, and Bedouinic groups tend to not develop cohesively. Yeah. Yes, so I think that's where we're going to leave it. We're about at 100 minutes. I will take one more question if anyone has it. But James, I hope I answered your question. Yeah, cloudy skies and Mondays. We're about to be at Monday, so I know a little bit about Hildegard, one of the great Christian church leaders in the Middle Ages of being female, not as common, but there are great female leaders in church history, and she was one of them. Thank you for subscribing. Rodolfo, what is your question? You are a wonderful subscriber, a longtime member, and a longtime friendly neighborhood historian. Otasa, that's what I'm working towards, or at least this channel being my university and you being my students. But is it for me to dance? Is he asking me to dance? Yeah, probably, Simon, but we'll see. Luigi, yes, this channel is about history, social studies, geopolitics, all that stuff. Opinions on the Roman Republic. You know what? I think you just gave me the topic for next week's live stream, Q&A. Or live stream lecture. I think we're going to do that. That's a great question, Rodolfo. I think we're going to do that topic, the topic of the Roman Republic, and some of my opinions on it and its foundation, because it's something I haven't talked about a lot on the channel, the Roman Republic. I've done a series on the Roman emperors, so check that out, James. But I would love to do a series. I'd love to talk about the Roman Republic with you guys. So we'll do that next Saturday at 4 p.m. or next Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I know a little bit about Norway. I'm learning more and more. But Rodolfo has the question. Let's see here. Rodolfo has a question, and I want to answer because it's a really good one. And then we will in the chat. He says, "Why did Poland stay so religious through communism?" Basically, the communists knew that if they tried to stamp out religion completely, they did a lot of it. They did a lot of repression. But if they tried to stamp it out completely and violently, they would destroy their workforce. They would destroy their infrastructure, and they might face a revolution and some counter resistance. So they allowed some tolerance, but not a lot. But I believe that if you look at any Eastern European country, religion was driven underground, but it kind of just stayed in place. And the Christian religion in the Roman Empire, paradoxically, was heavily persecuted, especially during certain emperors' reigns, but it was growing all throughout that. And so I think that it was integral to their society, culture, and history. And I think the Poles couldn't forget their history. And despite the Marxist intention and the communist demands in the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc during the Cold War and before, that they forget their history and forget their culture. That was an integral part of who they were, and they couldn't just drop it overnight and go home. So I think, Rodolfo, that's why John Paul II, when he became the Pope, is such a huge part of bringing down communism in Eastern Europe, because he went and gave a speech to 6 billion, 16% of the Polish population went out to see him, and he did not hesitate to condemn communism. So very interesting stuff. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of Viking fighting, and there's a lot of forced conversion. There's a lot of violence in how Northern Europe became Christian. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, Simon, I've heard that theory before, that the Roman Empire became the Catholic Church, and maybe we should talk about that a little bit during our next week live stream lecture. We are going to talk about the Republic of Rome. Join us for that Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and you also have 8 p.m. Fridays and 7 p.m. Saturdays for our live stream Q&A. So really appreciate everybody and everything they are bringing up in the chat. Really appreciate you guys watching and listening. Please be sure to like and subscribe. Tell all your friends and family. Check out the live stream. Check out my playlist, Russian Tsars, English Kings and Queens, American Presidents, and Roman Emperors. Check out check out the live streams in the past and my full-length videos, all that great stuff. We really appreciate you guys and everything you are talking about. Battle of Hurungovka. I'm going to look that up. Thank you so much for that. And yes, anyways, so I hope you have a great week ahead of you, and we will see you in person on Friday. If I don't see you in the channel commenting and doing stuff and bringing up some stuff before then, again, consider liking and subscribing. Yeah, we're just wrapping up right now. I'm sorry if you're just joining us. I really appreciate you coming on. Consider liking and subscribing. Join us, though, Friday and Saturday of next week for a live Q&A. And next week's live stream lecture brought to you by the mind of Captain James Kirk, who basically has given us the inspiration for the Roman Republic, which will be my topic next Sunday on the live stream. Take care. Thank you so much for enjoying the content. I really appreciate all the love and support. It means a lot. Have a great week, and I will see you next week, and I will see you in channel. Have a good one. Bye-bye.